the forfeit of one's own right to their body, such as the ones derived by the rule of law and the Constitution of the United States, facilitates the capacity of their servitude under a deal with the devil, wittingly and unwittingly, both in the spiritual sense and in the physical sense, as the exchange with the Confederate communists materializes the subjugation of their person to the collective. Like the Borg, you will be assimilated, and resistance is futile. And as their property, your various advantages and services, such as attractive women, facilitate the function of prostitution. And in this rape culture from Plato's conspiracy on the noble lie, materializes the function of the centrally planned sexual market value, which then materializes the rape contracts, and such the escape from any of the rapes with a permit becomes unavoidable. And as the only way to protect themselves is from a legal procedure, which then is blocked from any remedies for the magic functions, simply reads the receipt of the permit for the sexual exchange, which means it cannot be considered against the rules or customs. Therefore, the rape in question cannot be considered a rape, and therefore all of the historic positions by the white supremacist Confederacy, such as the argument that women can't get pregnant until they enjoy the sex, and so you should sit back and enjoy it, indicating, of course, that women have some random capacity to not get raped, as rape becomes an impossibility according to the pseudoscience, which isn't just a direct, desperate grasp for fraud, but a material spell, according to the communist magic in their contract with the devil, which then materializes the function of the ignoring the thing and allowing it to dissipate until it's ignored and then acquires the full subjugation, until the person is humiliated into compliance with the rejection of reality and the acceptance of the lie, at which point, whatever the ridiculous thing is, such as women can't be raped because they wouldn't be able to be pregnant unless they enjoyed it, creates the material reality for that society, which are then demoralized and broken into subjugation and submission to that lie. And then it becomes their reality. And since it becomes the reality, they then have to accept whatever thing is provided to them. And then the rapes exponentially expand as the structure expands. It then becomes automated and normalized, and thus the exchanges from the military and intelligence, traumatizing the general public into their slavery subjugation, materializes the function of the capacity for them to do whatever they want for any reason, including race. And thus you have the materialization of the white supremacist communism from the Confederacy, such as the one promoted by Lindsey Graham according to these policies of treason, which then facilitates the activities of the proof that all of the women that approved of these policies or of that culture facilitate the function of their subjugation of their sexuality to the Confederate noble lie, which then materializes them as prostitutes, and all of their sex then materializes the political advancement as currency, which then facilitates the female narcissist's capture of other women, which are then traumatized and harassed into that completion, which then, being humiliated into compliance, succeeds in the humiliation ritual, which then allows them to be captured by the struggling, facilitating their compliance with the subjugation, which then allows them to be subordinated to a pimp and then distributed according to the political interests for the currency of the service of sex, which then facilitates the function of any of their individual interests, which, if they had not been subjugated by the mind-altering fake experiments such as the neural leak expansions, which are still secret, materializes the function of the manipulation of their mind in the destruction of the entirety of the will, asserting that it is not their body, and so they do not get to choose. And therefore, any acts of rebellion, which then would facilitate them being able to choose their own romantic interest, would then be condemned as they are not choosing to have sex with their own body, but they are stealing from the Communist Party a service and a product that belongs to the communists and not to them, and therefore they are conducting robbery by engaging in that product's distribution without the consent of their pimps. With the facilitation of the experimentation of people without consent or knowledge, then you have the breaking of the United States constitutional right of the persons, papers, and effects. And thus, if you are to be securing your body, you cannot be experimented without your knowledge or your consent, and therefore you have a direct violation in the breaking down of that constitution, which was supposed to have contracted a government to form a military with soldiers that put men in it, that contracted and swore an oath to the Constitution that they would not allow or tolerate the existence of that breach in this specifically mentioned thing, which is specifically being attacked. To that extent, you have that malicious demoralization of the lack of masculinity inside of the military, which has hyper exaggerated itself according to those material Confederate experiments, which then facilitates the function of the militia hyper accelerating into its training for the occult radicalization of the state established religion of the Confederates, which is the Druids' white supremacy, which is the same Druid white supremacy that formed the Nazis, and thus you have the exponential expansion of these various arrangements, which then materializes the function of their subordination to the racism, which then facilitates the retaliation and resubjugation of all of the other races that are not considered the right type of white, which then are abused maliciously in that subordination, as many of them having asserted their position under the communism to have made deals which allowed them to be strategically weakened, facilitates the collapse into the plantation, which then facilitates the hyperacceleration of the subordination for the extorted services, which then become state and mandatory religions. And thus, the state mandatory religion compels their compliance as the slavery is the religion, and therefore, the state established religion compels anyone who is moral to facilitate the compliance on the basis of the morality that their race makes them a slave, and their gender makes them a prostitute, all the while making these compelled purchases of the services and products from the people, which are then extorted and stolen from them, according to the white supremacist terrorism, which then facilitates the function of the compulsion of the takings clause and the obligation of the government to pay for everything that it takes, which then materializes the disconnection from reality of it being the government's property or the person's property, and therefore the non delivery of the sale must happen because the communists are white trash, which means they're going to skip out on the deal, such as a dine and dash, which then materializes the function of them consuming the entire value of the product and then skipping out on having to pay anything from the argument of their poverty, having already consumed the product, which then facilitates the function of their debt to the party, which is then systemically ignored as the function of the good communists would not argue with them over the function of the acceleration of the party, which then creates the posturing from the virtue signals and all of the magic distractions, which gets the person to ignore the thing until it dissipates in acceptance of the theft, which then materializes the function of the complete arbitrary eradication of law for the children of perdition, which, having stolen everything and subjugated the exchanges of all the properties into the centralized force, are then distributed according to the central plan of the white supremacists, according to the KKK operations of their terrorism and harassment, which includes the function of the distractions of engaging or tolerating the engagement of loosely connected associations, which are then countered by the hate crimes, social violence, such as the Klan's engagement of the harassment, which then facilitates the function of various subversions, such as the ones trained by the improv groups, which then facilitate the function of breaking down communication and the engagement or capacity to have engaged in the function of the connection, breaking apart the freedom of association, as they are not allowed any form of communication without that harassment, which then materializes the automation of their disconnection from reality as they are discovered themselves to be holistically isolated and alone and surrounded by enemies, which were the minority predator. Despite their minority status, the divide and conquer tactics having been applied facilitates the competence of the enemies of the United States to conquer it due to the lack of masculinity inside the United States military, which would have alternatively engaged in performing national security against all threats, foreign and domestic. And it being said that no foreign enemy will ever be able to destroy the United States, but the only threat to America is the one inside. And the United States military, having specialized or claiming specialty in insurgent terrorism, would have functionally understood this, and therefore anyone seeking the immunities or protections are confessing in the function of protecting themselves from that in that mechanism as the material insurgent terrorist threat, which then facilitates the parasite function, which then any masculinity would ignore and then retaliate against, facilitating the function of a safe public, materializing the activity of the purpose of their office into base reality, allowing for the longevity of the United States government and of its people, which is the functional saying, the home of the free because of the brave. And its inverse, therefore, must also be true, that the rise of the trans insurrectionists, insurgents of the Confederacy, is the reason why none can ever be free again. As Ronald Reagan said, if we lose liberty here, then there will be nowhere else for it to grow. And therefore, those who had the most to lose were found in astonishment as doing the least into preventing its loss. The Soviet Union, having engaged in the insurgencies, facilitated the corruption and manipulation of the United States, and boasting of their successes, test the general public when they said that the United States leaders do more to destroy the United States than we ever did. They are, in fact, admitting to their demoralized successes as the taken over leaders, being the demoralized group, facilitate the function of the expansion of that military warfare of the hybrid insurrection is the confession of its success, and therefore their distraction function, which then can be disposed of, which then facilitates the false security of having beaten the distraction, allows for the true parasite to fester and mature. They are consistently the irrelevant value, and therefore the function requires them under their fake equity and spell fraud always the relevant value, and therefore the function of their poverty prevents them from having to pay for the products, and therefore their wealth facilitates the justification of why everyone must respect them as a superior elite, and therefore you functionally understand that the scam of these exchanges are derived by the delusional state of the psychopathic, which, being completely disconnected from reality, are a threat to themselves and others, belonging, of course, into a psychological asylum, which is the only safe place for these delusional loons. Therefore, the function of them being a threat to themselves and others requires us to protect the human civilian population and to purge these nutties from the general public, for their general activities are exclusively the spread of a psychotic disease, which is their demoralization, corruption culture, which is rape culture, which is the function of lawfare and all forms of the delusional antisocial, anti-society, fraud against the government mechanisms, such as, but is not limited to, the fake position of immunities for their crimes, which then facilitates this specific expansion and harassment and compounding of those criminal functions, which then engage in the extortion and overspending of that resource, similar to the United States in the function of its spending of the regular dollar, which then becomes excessive to itself, which then turns into American debt. And then the function of its overspending creates the function of them having to rely on alternate resources, such as these criminal exchanges. And if you engage in the function of the immunity for the criminal exchanges, then you actively rob the general public into abject poverty as it is degrown into the trash can, and therefore the functional act of treason against the United States in the compelled poverty under the same strategy as has always been used to destroy culture in this way, such as, but it's not limited to, the direct quote, like the former president of Sri Lanka, which collapsed his country into debt, having sold it to enemies of his country, which then engaged in the function of the provision of those debts, leaving them with the bill and to lick their wounds in their poverty, which is the hybrid mechanism strategy to engage in acts of treason in its material value, which is the unescapable inevitability if the United States does not wake up, force the duel, which is between David Bowles under his obstructed title being recognized by the United States Congress in order to engage in the function of the restoration of it in the pursuit of the remedy with Congress, which is the definition, or by definition, a declaration of war against the enemies of the United States, foreign and domestic, which is, was, and will continue to be the Confederacy and its allies, which then being proven as a threat to the United States must be crushed with absolute force. Therefore, the acknowledgement of the things hidden becoming material reality requires Congress to order the delivery of the United States military under David Bowles' control in order to execute this war against all enemies to the Constitution, foreign and domestic, founded first and foremost off of the investigations submitted to Congress determining the validity of the threats and how to solve them, facilitating their approval or co-signing of the policies to enact the function, purpose of their office and its responsibilities. Under the United States Constitution, it is illegal for the government to arrange for processes, official and unofficial and others, which would exhaust the public in order to collapse their status, which is the war of attrition being leveraged in its specific violation in this arrangement, which is then procured by the delays once they have acquired their economic terrorism to facilitate the economic violence in order to engage in the exhaustions, materializing the function of their violation in contempt and war against the United States and their system of treason, which, being a threat to national security, requires absolute force in order to retaliate and crush this insurrection. And the co-conspirators to that insurrection for the Confederates' treason against the Constitution materializes the function of each and every threat that they have postured to be countered systemically, which will require men in the United States military to gain self-respect under the basis of the development of the proper discipline, which then facilitates their execution of the compulsion or embarrassment of the government into performing its responsibilities without these malicious delays and extortions in order to collapse the statuses by that war of attrition, which is strictly prohibited. Now, the obstruction of work materializes the collapse of the resources from the profits of the contracts, which would then stack and engage in future trades, which would materialize anyone's perceived wealth and therefore status, and therefore the capacity to materialize human decency, uh, reflected from the amenities of that status. So, by definition, their position stating that they've done it too long is irrelevant, as the function requires the assertion that they, having, according to the white supremacist central planned economy, targeted the projected successes, which means not only do they know about its validity, they have certified their own price sets for it by the competition, asserting that they would have lost with the competition in place, therefore having to attack it in order to prevent said value and therefore disguise and defraud the records and the courts materially.